9 years ago this July, one Warhammer Fantasy Battle player burnt his massive Dark Elf army to a crisp and filmed it for YouTube, immolating what is estimated to be about £2,000 worth of Games Workshop products in the space of a few minutes. This single act would go into the Guinness World Record books as the most middle-class protest of all time, before being knocked off the top spot in 2023 by those people who scattered jigsaws onto the courts at Wimbledon. But what on earth could have caused this man to go full Rage Against the Machine in his back garden? If you fell asleep 10 years ago and have only just woken up, you're probably wondering to yourself, why did Warhammer Fantasy Battle go away? What's this new Age of Sigmar thing? What happened to all my shares in Theranos? They must be worth a fortune now. Don't worry, I have all the answers. In the last decade, a price of beer in London has almost doubled, your partner has moved in with someone else, Theranos went bankrupt, and Warhammer Fantasy Battle became Age of Sigmar, before being resurrected as Warhammer the Old World. I understand that's a lot of information to take in all at once, but I'll start with the most important thing. What happened to Warhammer Fantasy? Before we start unpacking that particularly thorny subject, I have to reveal part of the magic trick behind wargaming. There are different archetypes of wargamer. The company behind Magic the Gathering realised that there are 3 types of Magic players: Timmy, Johnny and Spike. But wargamers exist on a spectrum. Not that spectrum. Okay, maybe a little bit on that spectrum. At one end is Historical Henry, and at the other is Casual Christoph, with Tournament Terry existing in his own little pocket dimension somewhere in the middle. Everyone is somewhere on that spectrum. Maybe not at the extreme ends, but somewhere. Historical Henry loves the fact that the setting is complete. Historical Henry wants to buy, or more likely already owns, 100 Assyrian pikemen, and probably knows more about Assyria than the entire British Library. At the other end of that spectrum is Casual Christoph. If you go full Christoph, then you just kind of wander into a shop every few months and buy stuff that looks cool. Christoph walks into a shop and says, "Cool, that model looks like something out of Dark Souls. Wow, that's an Elder Avatar. Awesome. Oh, look at that massive robot. Radical." But how does that explain Age of Sigmar, you might say? Well, let's find out. As a product, Warhammer Fantasy Battle was the equivalent of a guy building a company from scratch out of his shed. And in some ways it was a product built out of a shed, built to cater for people who were buying miniatures for use in Dungeons and Dragons. It had a core fan base who were dedicated, but it had a critical flaw. You had to be dedicated. This wasn't a case of playing a small game with 20 models aside on your kitchen counter. This was a choreographed ballet of movement and maneuver, with even elite armies clocking in at about 100 models. Meanwhile, somewhere in their transition from effectively running out of the back of a shed to their first 100 retail stores, Games Workshop realised that the average customer in the hobby only lasted about 2 years. Therefore, onboarding new players was the only way to survive, let alone grow. So any new player that walked into a shop was given the unspoken choice. On one side, 5 Space Marines that looked like they could be painted with a single spray can you got at Halford's, or on the other side, 10, 15, 20 High Elf or other humanoid models that required an entire rainbow's worth of paint colours and a series of mystically taught painting techniques to look right. Unfortunately, this only led one way. One highly cited rumour at the time was, I think, that Warhammer Fantasy only accounted for about 7% of Games Workshop's total sales. Another was that the entire sum of Warhammer Fantasy products was being outsold by a single box of Tactical Space Marines on the other side of the store. Unsurprisingly, this was not a sustainable business model. I'll tell you what else is built out of a shed, has a dedicated fan base and a completely unsustainable business model: this channel. You can support it on Ko-fi, the link is in the description below and also pinging up on the screen now. And after you've done that, click subscribe as well. I know subscriptions are a vanity metric, but I'm a vain man, and if I don't get one of those YouTube plaques, someone's gonna pay. Anyway, back to Warhammer. Asking the question of who killed Warhammer Fantasy Battle is the equivalent of pulling the pin on a grenade in any internet comment section. One senior figure has pointed to the customers who killed the game by not buying it, and I think they have a point, but I'd also say it is a little bit more complicated than that. Before you rush to the comment section, however, I want to just run you through the Warhammer Fantasy Battle release schedule and see if you can spot any problems. Let's say we put ourselves in the shoes of a hypothetical High Elf superfan. They probably need to have more sequins than these though. Starting in 1993, when 4th edition Warhammer Fantasy Battle was released, you brought the box with 20 archers and 20 spearmen. If you felt like upgrading the cardboard griffin and bolt thrower, you could buy a bunch of other units: Phoenix Guards, Swordmasters, White Lions, Shadow Warriors, and that awesome looking chariot. Then, a bit later that year, you can pick up the Dragon Princes and some Reaver Knights. Your High Elf superfan is now pretty happy. They have an amazing complete Warhammer Fantasy Battle army. Then in the following year, 1994, they could buy Prince Imric on his cool looking dragon. But then the troubles begin. Because aside from a new rulebook and a new army book, your superfan doesn't really need to buy very much from you ever again. Releasing single characters at £5 a pop when your High Elf superfan only ever needs a maximum of one of them isn't going to really make anyone very much money at all. And if you're paying to host a retail store or selling your stock to someone else to host a retail store, then the problems begin the very next year. Because in 1995, your superfan doesn't have anything to buy. In 1996, there was a new edition of the rules, and you had to buy the 5th edition box set. But if you don't want the Bretonnians or the Lizardmen, then you had nothing to buy. In 1997, you could buy the 5th edition army book and the Everqueen and the Maiden Guard and add them into your army. And then we run into problem number 2, because as the setting is closed, Games Workshop can only really make resculpts of existing units that your superfan might not actually need or want because they already own them. In 1998, you could buy some Lothern Sea Guard, as well as some alternate sculpts for your spearmen and your archers, and the Tears of Aisha campaign back if you had a mate who had a Dark Elf army. In 1999, you don't have anything to buy. In the year 2000, you don't have anything to buy. In 2001, you can buy the 6th edition of Warhammer Fantasy Battle, as well as the White Dwarf with the copy of the Ravening Horde's army list. In 2002, you can buy the High Elf army book, but once again we go through the cycle of selling alternate sculpts for the units that your superfan might already have, as well as some multi-part plastic spearmen and plastic archers. So many units here that you can rebuy the entire army that you bought 9 years ago if you want it, which is just as well, because in 2003, you don't have anything new to buy. In 2004, you don't have anything new to buy. In 2005, you can buy a plastic repeater bolt thrower to replace the metal one that you bought 3 years ago. You can probably see where I'm going with this, but I'm going to follow it through to its conclusion anyway. In 2006, it's 7th edition Warhammer Fantasy Battle, and you can buy that rulebook, but that main box didn't contain anything else for you. In 2007, you can buy the 7th edition High Elf army book. Maybe another Garner Dragon? Maybe another chariot? Some alternate Shadow Warriors? In 2008, you don't have anything new to buy. In 2009, someone died and there was an incident with a pigeon. Check the comments section for the reference there. In 2010, Warhammer Fantasy 8th edition, Island of Blood. This set actually contained plastic High Elves and some Skaven, so your superfan gets a bunch of new alternate sculpts for their army once again. In 2011, nothing new to buy. In 2012, nothing new to buy. In 2013, however, you finally get new kits, along with your 8th edition High Elf army book. You've got the Lothern Skycutter, and you've got the Flamespire or Frostheart Phoenix. New units for your army. And to celebrate this bouquet of new releases, in 2014, you could start buying the End Times books, which effectively killed the setting off for the best part of a decade. So that's 22 years of releases with only 4 new units? Half of which were released a year before the setting itself was totally shelved, and several occasions where our High Elf superfan just had nothing to buy for 3 or 4 years in a row. Sometimes you could just skip 7 or so years of releases by just buying a rulebook and an army book and leaving it at that. And High Elves were one of the well-supported armies. Imagine if you decided Bretonnians were the army for you. They got a release in 1997 and again in 2004, and then nothing for nearly 20 years. Of course, Historical Henry loved Warhammer Fantasy. His army gave him 22 years worth of value. The trouble is that Games Workshop just spent the last 2 decades paying for retail space to stock with products that your fan has already bought. Warhammer Fantasy Battle inadvertently catered too much to Historical Henry, and Casual Christoph just wandered to the other side of the shop. But if you think things are bad there, they get worse still. Games Workshop sells a lot of product directly to people through their retail stores, but the majority of the product is sold to friendly local game stores who themselves sell onwards to their customers. And those businesses are smart, or at least the ones that stay in business for longer than a few years are smart. Now you've got to put yourself in the shoes of a Games Workshop sales manager trying to sell Warhammer Fantasy Battle to one of those FLGSs. What do you say? I mean, what do you say? I know 6th edition didn't sell well, I know 7th edition didn't sell well, but 8th edition, yeah, no, it's gonna sell this time. Yeah, definitely gonna sell. The FLGS isn't gonna want to hear about your tweaks to the magic system, or how elegant the rules are, or how it's so much more of a clever game than Warhammer 40,000. The FLGSs are gonna want to know that it sells, because if it doesn't sell, they'll just put a copy of Talisman in its place, or Settlers of Catan, or Carcassonne, or anything. Even some new game that just popped up that they're taking a risk on. And speaking of the devil, the news that Steamforged Games have taken over War Machine is quite timely, because the sales staff at Steamforged Games are going to have these exact same conversations with retailers and distributors worldwide right now, and they're going to have to do a whole lot better than, no really, this time it will sell, trust me bro, trust me. People who weren't interested in it before aren't going to want to know about small changes and tweaks. They are going to want to see big changes. You aren't dealing with the feelings of people who've bought your product, taken it home, unwrapped it, played it and enjoyed it. You're dealing with the feelings of retail managers who are paying to have the option of filling their shelves with your product. And these managers are very aware of the product death spiral. For my next trick, allow me to visually demonstrate the product death spiral. Imagine what you see on screen right now is a shelf in a shop. Product A goes onto the shelf. It doesn't sell, so it just kind of sits there and doesn't need to be reordered again. Eventually, product B comes along that does sell, so product A gets put in the literal bargain bin and sold off for cheap to make way on the shelf for more of product B. When it gets sold for cheap in a store, the aftermarket price of product A collapses, because why buy second-hand on eBay for 20% off when you can buy it for new at 30%? And since more products are going into the bargain bin all the time, and a store can't have the bin overflowing, if it hasn't sold at 30% off, the next week it's going to be 40%. And so it becomes a race to the bottom. Once you reach 50% off, the company just wants shot of the product and are prepared to get rid of it at pretty much no profit just to make more room on their shelves. You can actually see this happening in real time if you look at a company like Wayland Games and see their hot deals section. This is product they just want gone. So goes the way of every failed miniature game, board game, Kickstarter, and in fact product in existence. Looking at Keyforge, this is a perfectly fine game. 2 players could have a great time with a couple of decks. But do you want to own a good game, or do you want to own something that has value? Once it's reached the terminal end of the death spiral, customers don't want it at all, for any money. This was RRP £15. It's now failing to sell at £2 on eBay. Then somehow it gets worse and weirder, because if you wanted to fill that hypothetical shelf with Magic the Gathering booster boxes, you'll probably turn them around in a month or so to make room for more Magic the Gathering booster boxes, and your Magic the Gathering customers will gladly buy that product. But if you wanted to stick a unit of Dragon Princes on that shelf, it doesn't work. Why is that? Because over 30 years ago, 2 different groups of people had different ideas about the fantasy universes that they were both creating. In 1993, Richard Garfield debuted Magic the Gathering at Gen Con with deliberately powerful rare cards that you may or may not have a chance to draw in every pack. Meanwhile, also in 1993, Andy Chambers and Bill King just decided that players could only ever have 1 unit of Dragon Princes, because in the book that they had just written, Dragon Princes were supposed to be rare within the lore that they just wrote. And so we see the difference between something being rare because someone tells you it's rare, and being rare because it actually is rare. Fun fact that's related to what I've just said, Magic the Gathering actually deleted the lore from its rulebook after the first printing, the first alpha run of the game. It's not all lost though. The idea of nearly immortal elite armoured infantry riding dragons might just come around for Games Workshop somewhere in the future. Foreshadowing. Foreshadowing, foreshadowing. Sadly, the old warhorse that propelled Games Workshop out of the depths of the 90s and into the heady heights of the publicly traded stock market had to be taken behind the shed by the farmer one cold winter's night and shot right in its head. The first edition of Warhammer Age of Sigmar was profitable but widely panned by the existing community. After all, it was a sudden pivot away from a legendary rank and flank wargame that people had invested thousands of pounds worth of their money and decades of their life playing into a game where players were, and I kid you not, encouraged to pretend to ride an imaginary horse for a bonus in combat. For many people, it was like watching someone bury your beloved family pet while dressed as a Teletubby. It's very easy to start talking about what Age of Sigmar version 1 got wrong. Plenty of people have done so. But what few people want to talk about is the secret sauce that it got right. And that sauce consisted of 3 very critical things. The first was that this time you could have a quick game of 20 models on the kitchen counter. The second was that the armies had been divided amongst 4 grand alliances: order, chaos, destruction and death. So instead of a customer being locked to one of 17 different factions, they could pick and choose from a buffet. And the final one, we're going to come to them later. Historical Henry hated it, but Casual Christoph was curious. And Christoph, in case you hadn't guessed, spends a lot more money than Henry. When it comes to the development of Age of Sigmar, it's best I just show you the horse. Does everyone know the horse? Not that one? This one. Okay, this really is a meme about rushing a piece of work to quickly complete it. But if you flip this horse, it represents the development of Age of Sigmar in real time, from the original brief, literally on the back of a post-it note, to what it is today. Possibly a textbook example of jumping out of a window and assembling a plane on the way down. When its first edition was released in 2015, it didn't include points for units. Players were supposed to just balance the forces they were using against each other before the game. But slightly over a year later, the General's Handbook was released, which gave players the tools they needed to build an army to a points limit, and since then, it hasn't looked back. In 2017 came the Karandan Overlords, an army with a visual design that was so wild it would never have worked in Warhammer Fantasy. Followed in 2018 by the Idoneth Deepkin and their awesome looking giant turtle. But the second edition was a whole nother story. By 2018, the rules had been tested and refined, and the star of the Soul Wars box set was the Nighthaunt, a riff on the ghosts of old Warhammer. They were a faction of spirits that were easy to put together and paint, especially with the contrast paints that were coming the very next year. They were perfect for beginners to enter the hobby, but they weren't the only new race in town. Age of Sigmar was originally released with an even bigger secret weapon, the third ingredient of the secret sauce. The crown jewel in the Age of Sigmar strategy was the new Stormcast Eternals. In this one faction, Games Workshop created a component that was completely missing from Warhammer Fantasy. They would be an army that everyone had access to. They would be in every box set, and they would have releases every year. They're just like Space Marines, said Historical Henry as an insult. They're just like Space Marines, said Casual Christoph as a compliment. Yes, they received mockery at first, but stunts like Mantic's giant cardboard statue would come back to bite them, in the same way as that clip of the then CEO of Microsoft, Steve Ballmer, mocking the iPhone for being too expensive. Taking a long-term bet against the behaviour of the biggest wargaming company in the world, with the best design team studio in the world, and a fresh new CEO that was willing to turn on a dime, isn't always a sensible move. Especially when, despite what you read on Reddit, Games Workshop has an exceptionally wealthy and rabidly passionate fanbase. And in 2021, the benefit of drawing that horse from nothing gradually started to take hold. A lot of people, including me, didn't really like the design of the original Stormcast Eternals. They're just a bit too chunky. That's fine, said Games Workshop. Let's have another crack at them. Age of Sigmar's 3rd edition dropped with a brand new set of completely redesigned Stormcast Eternals. These were a big hit and a massive improvement on the originals. They were followed up with dragons, because, well, everyone loves dragons, and if you're making a faction to sell to everyone, you may as well just chuck in the biggest trope of fantasy as well. In May 2024, all of the original Stormcast kits were discontinued from production, ready for the 4th version of the game, and their reintroduction in newer form. Few people will enjoy a range rotation. I know, I totally get it. I mean, my doctor tells me that I need to cut down on drinking and attend special sessions, but you know, I have to, or I won't get my driving license back. were we talking about again? Remember when I said that the stock that sells has to supplant the stock that doesn't sell, otherwise the store goes out of business? Casual Christoph needs something to buy when he comes in with his pockets full of cheese. And if he wasn't buying one of the original Stormcast Eternal Knight Velixors in the last decade, he isn't gonna buy one in the next 10. A range rotation is a bit like going to the dentist. No one likes it, but the alternative is tooth decay. I hated it when my Magic deck got rotated out of the standard format. I had to shred all of my rare cards and then dump the remains on my compost heap. Then all my old Lego sets got discontinued, so I melted them all down in acetone and flushed the resulting slurry through the sewage system. When my first metal Space Marine army was replaced with multi-part plastic, I shot them into space on a rocket. Why does nothing old have any value? The last time I tried to use my Forge World Sakaran Venator in a game of Warhammer 40,000, all my friends and everyone in the store revealed iron bars and severely beat me, breaking several of my ribs and leading to an extended stay in hospital. My doctor said that I may never fully recover my memory and I'll have lapses of concentration for the rest of my life. My doctor said that I may never fully recover my memory and I'll have lapses of concentration for the rest of my life. My doctor said, anyway, back to Stormcast. I can give you the elevator pitch for them in about 5 seconds. They are souls that have been forged by the will of Sigmar. Every time they die, they're reforged but lose a part of themselves. Here's the big secret, the really nasty one that people hate. Stormcast Eternals are kind of a little bit boring. But there's a difference between being kind of boring and being something that people refuse to engage in at all. They aren't backed up by 4 decades worth of historical background, timelines and family trees. But Casual Christoph no longer immediately walks to the other side of the store containing the Warhammer 40,000 releases. Stormcast Eternals are fairly boring to me, but a large part of me, in case you haven't guessed it, is a historical Henry. I find the Deepkin, the Realm Lords, the Daughters of Cain, the Karandran more interesting, but Google Trends will display the full story. Space Marines are kind of boring, many people tell me this. But if I replace a thumbnail on a video of a really cool looking Warhammer Fantasy model with a Space Marine, 3 or 4 times the amount of people will click on that video. Some of those people will go on to tell me how boring they think Space Marines are. And that's exactly how Age of Sigmar wins. Stormcast Eternals are the faction that means we get to see models like Usharan the Mortarch of Delusion, or those weird and wild cute little animal models, or that gorgeous looking Free Guild Cavalier Marshal. They are the engine that powers the game. They are the engine that Warhammer Fantasy never had. You don't have to search far to find a Warhammer Fantasy Battle fan insisting that it could have been great, it could have been saved, it could have been a contender to Warhammer 40,000. Sometimes I ask how, curious to know exactly how Games Workshop could have saved the long declining game system. But the answer is always the same. Games Workshop should have spent more on it. The trouble is, Warhammer Fantasy Battle had several computer games, an entire MMORPG, comics, short storybooks, novels, Forge World resin kits, its own skirmish game Mordheim, and over 30 years of exposure in the worldwide retail market. Short of sponsoring a professional sports team, I'm not sure what else could have been done to save the game in its final form. Well, that's not true. There is one thing that could have been done. The ultimate irony of the situation is that it seems that the best thing to do was to just consolidate all of the rules into 3 books and let the fans have it. Every year, new players enter the hobby of miniature wargames. Most will go to Warhammer 40,000, again, Space Marines are massive. But some of them, 30% at one estimate, will try out Age of Sigmar. And some of these players might wonder about the game that died to birth it, Warhammer Fantasy Battle. You mean Warhammer the Old World, they'll say. And you'll say, no, it's not the same. There's only 9 core faction. My Skaven army isn't supported, so I'll be a whipping boy at any official tournaments. Workshop could have supported it properly, but they were too busy doing rails of coke off the tits of hookers. Or something like that. I don't know. I won't be there. Ultimately, who knows? Maybe there is an alternate universe out there where Warhammer Army's Stormcast Eternals took off, leading to a resurgent old world setting written by the second coming of Tolkien and Pratchett, who reimagined a world so rich in character that we were all dying to find out what happened next. Maybe the outpouring of anger at the end times was needed, a final cathartic 2-minute hate with a brutal finale to wipe the slate clean, ready for Age of Sigmar. so that a new product could be created in its ashes. The heat death of the universe followed by another big bang to repopulate it all over again. Time continues its inexorable move forward, and over the past decade we've seen a new CEO, new management, and in 2024 Games Workshop released Warhammer the Old World, followed by Age of Sigmar version 4, conclusively proving that the two systems can not only live together but be released within 6 months of each other without cannibalizing each other's player base. But before I go, I'll leave you with one final terrifying thought. Could something like this ever happen to Warhammer 40,000? It sure is getting a lot of factions, 20 at the last count, including about a dozen sub-factions. It's certainly possible, if not probable, but then again, does any product last forever? Remember the iPod? Anyway, I need to get back to writing battle report videos before Games Workshop releases another nostalgia-adjacent game system. If you want to hear me talk more about Warhammer the Old World, check out this video here. Otherwise, I'll see you next time.